Good morning to all of you, and peace be with you. Assalamu alaikum. And it gives me a great pleasure to introduce two of my colleagues that I have worked with for many, many years from the Interfaith partners, not necessarily the Interfaith partners, but because there was a group called Interfaith Partners through MRDI. And from that, the IFLC was evolved, and myself and Bob Brutel to my right are among the founding members of the IFLC, Interfaith Leadership Council of Metropolitan Detroit. And next to him is Reverend Mikhail Kuru, who is the Executive Director of the Interfaith Center for Racial Justice. Again, he dragged me into the organization after we had our issues and problems in the city of Warren trying to put up our Islamic center. And so we started this relationship. I presided for a few years the ICRJ. I am currently a board member on both. I'm the treasurer of IFLC, and Bob Brutel, who would be speaking first, I assume, since his name, Reverend Mikhail Kuru first, okay. Bob Brutel is the chairman of the Interfaith Leadership Council. I know we don't have much time. I can go more into their bios, but let's hear from them, and we welcome them on your behalf. And the subject that they will be discussing is, let me find it very quickly here, importance of interfaith groups in the age of Islamophobia. Very important subject. Without further ado, Reverend Mikhail Kuru.
Good morning and Assalamu alaikum. The paragraph that was written for this little workshop today said, one of the biggest factors contributing to Islamophobia is lack of knowledge about Islam and no interaction with a member from the Muslim community. So those with ICRJ, with our organization, we were an organization set up to fight racism, to deal with issues black-white. And after 9/11, within the community that we were working in, which is Macomb County, the community began to become more diverse, and we found that people of color in every ethnicity were being discriminated against. And so formal to us was to set up programs to teach people about other cultures and faith traditions. And we called that program Listen, Learn, and Live. Some of you have participated in some of our Listen, Learn, and Live programs. But the context of that program was very different than work that I had done prior with interfaith organizations. I had been a community organizer in Chicago, and then I came up to Washtenaw County and organized there. And when I started that effort, because I personally was new to other world religions, the focus that we had was to try to bring people together, first clergy, and have, for instance, this month, the imam talk to the other clergy about this is Islam. Then the next month, I had a Roman Catholic priest, and this is Roman Catholicism. And the next month, and we did that throughout a year so that others could get to know those other faith traditions as a way of bringing some common understanding. What was missing in that work, and I didn't recognize it at the time until I later worked with the Interfaith Center and started the Listen, Learn, and Live, was the fact that it's not so much about intellectual understanding. In fact, Bob and I and Dawood and were talking just before this conference about Islamophobia. And so I want to kind of take our conversation to that point, because the number one issue, in my opinion, on this is that latter part, no interaction with a member from the Muslim community, right? It's not about simply knowledge. If more Americans know about Islam, they're still fighting a whole avalanche of propaganda against Muslims, right? So it's kind of like, if you're going to try to defeat this avalanche of Islamophobia with this little bit of knowledge about what Islam is, it's not going to work, in my opinion. What's most important in these things, in my opinion, is allowing other folks to know a Muslim, to have that relationship with a Muslim. Because right now, the narrative is being controlled by those forces beyond you. So when folks are sitting in their living room and they turn on the TV, and the image they get, let's go back to 9/11, the first image they get is Osama bin Laden, right? What's their image of Islam? What do they equate? Osama bin Laden, right? That's the image they have. That's the person that they equate with that. And it's only continued with the media as we've gone forward, whether it's ISIS, Al-Qaeda, whatever that particular image is, that's what they have. And the only way to effectively counter that is for that image in their mind to be, as Bob just so Dawood, I couldn't believe you said that, because it was like you read my mind with the notes that I had kind of come in here, is if you meet Najah Bazzi, the first response you have from that is, wow, what an incredible woman. It's like walking in the midst of divinity. The peace that she exudes, the presence that she has, which makes you then go, if all Muslims are like her, I want more of this, right? And from a Christian tradition, which I am an ordained United Church of Christ pastor, our work is often to try to communicate that they will know we are Christians by our love. It's a little hymn that folks sing in churches as they grow up. They will know we are Christians by our love. They'll know who we are by the acts that we do to other people. And that's foundational. And so as we struggle with this kind of work, the ultimate piece for it is for the Muslim community to get engaged in your community, in every facet of your community, whether that means the school board, the school PTOs, whether it's the Kiwanis Club, the Rotary Clubs, whatever factor, because if others know someone else, their image in their mind becomes of Islam. My relationship with Mustafa, when I think of Islam, the first person that pops into my head is Imam al-Turk, because we worked so closely on issues together. So that's the first and foremost point that I wanted to lift up. And I'll come back, but I wanted to allow Bob to have a moment to talk about the historical roots of interfaith work.
Thank you, Mikhail. Well, I think it's important. I teach history as an adjunct at the University of Detroit Mercy, and so I personally find that historical context is important to kind of getting your bearings in where we're at and maybe why we're at a different place historically now than we might have felt we were at earlier times. There's been a significant number of Muslims in the metropolitan Detroit area for a long time. We've had really a good community, especially of Lebanese and Syrians, that came to Detroit in the early 1900s to work in the auto industry. And so we went along with those folks kind of under the radar, thinking themselves as fully integrated into the Detroit community. Then 2001 comes along and the World Trade Centers come down, and there was a sea change, a complete change in the attitude. Suddenly, this community of Muslims and of people from the Middle East, suddenly they are the focus of a lot of attention. And even though in the metropolitan Detroit, there are a fairly small proportion of the 4 million people thereabouts that live in what we might call the greater Detroit metropolitan area, they are the focus of a lot of attention. And the whole country, I think, if you know about Muslims and read about Muslims much at all, you kind of know that Dearborn is a place where Muslims live. And so we get this constant stream of protesters who show up at the significant mosque in Dearborn that is, the Islamic Center of America, because they can stand in front of it and they've got the minarets behind them, and the whole image suits this photo op kind of idea they have because they're looking for publicity. And they're finding it easy to get that kind of publicity these days. You add that to the fact that since 1965, we have had, when President Johnson signed the immigration bill that opened the doors of America to Eastern immigrants, and we've had this significant stream of immigrants coming to America now since 1965, and it's not going to stop. And so the experience of people like my parents, for instance, who would have grown up in the 30s and 40s, their experience was of immigrants that had come to America during the early part of the 1900s, say from 1880 to 1920. And after 1925, when the doors were sort of shut to immigration in America, they were dealing with people who were becoming very much integrated into American society. And so they were dealing with third-generation immigrants. Many of the people today that your friends and neighbors will get to meet will be people who are conversant in two languages, right? Unfortunately, these neighbors often think, why don't they speak English? Well, they do, actually. They just don't speak English to people who speak another language more fluently than English, right? The first language is easier to come by, easier to speak. But as a matter of fact, the embarrassing thing is that most Americans, those folks who call themselves Americans, don't speak two languages. And so it's to their detriment that they actually don't understand another culture the way you all understand other cultures. So here we are in this situation now where we have a significant number of immigrants who have come to America and now are sort of visible for various reasons, both good and not so good reasons, but very visible to the rest of the community. And so we often talk about this as sort of a teaching moment or a moment of crisis, whichever one you want to pick, but it's a moment when we're at a watershed point where we can either do something really good with that energy and try to transform it, or we can let it sort of do what it wants to do, which seems to be to disintegrate and to be nasty in many ways. But you have to really do something. You can't, if you want to combat that energy, Reverend Kuro called it an avalanche. That's as good an image as any. It may cover us up and suffocate us unless we've got a plan, unless we organize in some way. And so, we're here to talk about the importance of interfaith groups. Interfaith groups became important in the early part of the 20th century for Catholics and Jews as they tried to get along with their Protestant neighbors. America was very virulently anti-Catholic, burning down convents, roughing Catholics up, lots of fights in the schoolyards between Catholics and non-Catholics, fights over which Bible to use and how it should be read, fights over whether or not it should be read in school or not, bishops having to tell their students to walk out of class because they were being treated badly in the public schools. I mean, it was really nasty. And what came of that was interfaith organizations formed to bring allies to the cause of Catholics. Now, in this present time, when Catholics in this state, for instance, in Michigan, Catholics are about 20% of the population. New York State, the same. Many, Illinois probably same percentage, 25%. So you can't think of it in those terms anymore. We've had a Catholic president. We've got a Catholic vice president currently. There's, I think, 5 or 6 Catholics on the Supreme Court. So you're in a different place now. So the interfaith organizations are not so important for Catholics as they are for Muslims, for maybe Mormons, for Hindus, for Sikhs. There's a whole group of people now that need these allies more than the Catholics do. But I want to put it in that context because American nativism has been a really virulent, nasty form of American politics since the 1800s. Political parties were formed on the basis of American nativism. You see it now in the campaign for the presidency, this nativism being tapped by various members of the Republican Party as they try to vie for the presidency. And you say, this is all new. It is not new. They are tapping into a very strong stream of American politics. And so again, Mikhail's image of an avalanche is an apropos image because it is this stream of energy that has been in American politics since the 1800s, and Muslims are experiencing it now. But those of us who see that are really your allies in this. And so the interfaith organizations are needed in order for you to have allies within the larger community. At this point, my feeling is that what you see in Islamophobia right now is what you're going to continue to see for a long time, just pretty much at the level it's at, but it's at a serious level. So let's not kid that this is a manageable level. But nevertheless, I see this strong stream of Islamophobia right now as continuing just the way you've seen it going these days. And so, insofar as we've seen it the way it is, I think we can start to organize to combat it with interfaith organizations and some other things. But interfaith is the thing we're talking about right now. So interfaith is a way to do that. And the critical part about that is that within interfaith, there are some faith values that we can use to kind of leverage the call to the rest of the community that we should do something and base it on our faith values. So there's some common values within the faith communities, and we need to use those, and we need to expect others to use those. And so when you come into situations, Mikhail just recommended that people join the Kiwanis Club, join the Rotary Club, your reaction may be, they don't want us. That's probably true. Not in an absolutely virulent sense, they don't want us. It's not like they've got a sign at the door that says, no Muslims allowed. But they aren't comfortable with Muslims, and they're not quite sure what to do with it, and you're going to have to deal with that discomfort and do it anyway, because you will break into that. These are people with good values, and like I say, you just have to get there and say, let's use the common values that we have. Most of you are Christians. You believe that God is love and that we should love one another. So do I. And then you get a chance to talk at the meetings and so on, and little by little, these things change. But if you expect people to open arms and say, we've got a place right here for a Muslim member, come on down, it's not going to happen. So this sense of organizing within interfaith, I think, is a larger question. It is organizing with the idea of an interfaith value that we all can take advantage of to start to break down those problem issues that might keep you out of there. And the last thing I'll mention before turning it back over to Mikhail is that insularity is the enemy. That is, it feels better to a first generation community to sort of stick together. I know that feels better, but it's not going to help. It may help you sort of survive your lives in some other ways. You need family and all of that. I'm not denying that. So do I. But if we don't force the issue of getting outside of the community and getting involved in other things, it is going to be a problematic condition as we go forward, because the more the community can be seen as isolated and kind of keeping to themselves, people are going to use that as their excuse. They're going to say, you folks really want to keep to yourselves. Therefore, that's why we don't invite you to stuff. That's why you're not involved, because you really want it that way. And the truth is, you don't really want it that way for your children, that's for sure. You want your children to be fully a part of the American culture and to be able to get the education and the jobs and so on that America promises. So that insularity, that staying in your own enclave, is dangerous in that sense. Not dangerous in any really, overall sense. It's okay to have folks that you are part of your own community that you like and you worship with and so on. But if that's where it stops, if that's what it seems like to everybody outside the community, it is really dangerous. It will actually increase this problem of Islamophobia, because people will rationalize their distrust of Muslims by saying they really want to stay apart, and therefore you can imagine all kinds of odd things that they think, right? And you hear some of these things, and you say, where did that come from? Well, because people who don't know other people who don't have a good feeling to start with rationalize those bad feelings by saying, well, they want to destroy us, they want Sharia, they want to take over our communities. Dearborn is a Muslim community, they got Sharia law there. You say, huh, what? Who said, where's the law in Sharia, Where did that come from? Well, it came from people who had no contact and who were trying to justify the fact that they have some ill feelings about Muslims. So I'll stop there for a minute.
Let me bring a very current topic that kind of illustrates the point that Bob just made about staying insulated from the community. How many folks are familiar with the issue that blew up the last month in Sterling Heights? Okay, what was that issue? Anybody, just yell it out loud. What happened? Pardon? They were against the mosque. For what reason? Simply because you were Muslims, right? In this community, highly educated members thought, going into having their mosque be built in Sterling Heights, that's what they were asking to do, where most of their members live, right? The American value, freedom of religion, a place to worship in their own home. Black and white, right? We're highly educated. Folks are going to want us as their neighbors. That was the thought that went in. They met with the city of Sterling Heights, and they started to follow the process. And the process said, if we do this, and if we do this, and if we do that, we're fine. They had never built relationships with the area that they wanted to have that mosque in. And in fact, they chose a plot of land that was not just the center of the Chaldean community, but meaning there's a lot of Muslims that live in that area, but an area that they hadn't had the relationship with the priest at that church. There was no interfaith organization within Sterling Heights to help support them. So as the issue was used by others, and let me be very clear that it has been used by others. There were outside agitators that came in to propagate Islamophobia. There were political candidates that wanted to use the issue to try to placate the Chaldean community and get votes from them. All of that was going on. And the question that folks like Bob and others from outside of Macomb are asking is, what's the response? Where's the interfaith community in this? What's going on in there? What's ICRJ doing? What can we do? The reality was there was no interfaith group. There were no allies. So even though that community had an ethnic diversity community or committee from the city, a city agency with a Muslim on it, they didn't say a word. Sterling Heights was a welcoming community. That's a designation that says they're supposed to be welcoming to immigrant groups. They said nothing. One Macomb is a political or a public relations campaign by the county executive there to say we're one Macomb. But they didn't say anything when a particular group of people, Muslims, were being persecuted, were being prejudiced behavior towards them. And if it was a very ugly scene. And part of that all took place, unfortunately, of course, hindsight is 2020, right? If we could have gone back in time, AICC should have reached out to Mustafa and said, Iona, you guys had issues in Warren. Walk us through this process. Tell us what we should do. One of the things I'm sure that Imam would have said is you need to have interfaith partners. You need to have allies in this fight. Now, that doesn't mean that this wouldn't have perhaps had the same conclusion to this point, but it perhaps could have changed the dynamic to now Muslims all over the metropolitan area were rightfully upset at the Chaldean community, feeling that they were another immigrant group seeking acceptance in America was now discriminating against other, groups of a minority group, right? Doesn't make sense. So that's the real, to put it in a very tangible context, that's what happens when you're isolated. That continues to happen. It doesn't mean that having interfaith partners will correct everything. It just gives you a stronghold within the community. Because unfortunately, Iona, as Iona's expanded, the cities pulled back. They weren't, where was the city's support, right? You've been a good neighbor for 8 years in Warren, but yet when you wanted to expand, you again were treated as if, in fact, Imam al-Turk was told to go back home. In his response, this is my home, right? There's no home to go back to, right? So it doesn't mean that interfaith partnerships alone can stop this. It's really, I hate to be so blunt, but it's really it's the burden of the Muslim community to engage fully in your communities, and then when it's appropriate to have relationships with interfaith partners. It's got to be hand in hand.
Yeah, I think that this is a really important thing. It's unfortunate but true that no one is going to take up this cause for Muslims in the kind of way that Muslims will need to take it up for themselves. As concerned as I am, and for as much advice as I am asked to give in interfaith settings, I will not have half the influence that any one of you could have by just seeking out a civic group within your own community and being an active part of it. And I can't emphasize that more. I will not have anywhere near the effect that Muslims getting together and saying, we're going to deal with this together and we're going to pull together resources and we will support interfaith organizations, but we will also have to do some other things with those resources. But we'll support interfaith organizations. And let me give another specific. I think that it's generally felt within the interfaith organizations that I'm aware of that the Muslim community is very hospitable and willing to invite people to open houses, to come to the masjid, to be a part of those things. But the community does not seem in any kind of numbers whatsoever to go out to other people's things. And frankly, the people that come to the mosque are almost already converts, right? You almost don't need them. I mean, you do need them in the sense that you need to build allies within your community. So don't get me wrong, I'm not against that at all. Do that as often as you wish. Christians have pancake breakfasts and all that kind of thing. That's exactly what that's for. Continue doing that. Invite your friends to that. But the really key thing and the more difficult thing is to go out to other people's groups, to make sure that you're there when they need something. You have common cause really with strong common cause with the nativism against Jews, which continues, and the racism that is directed at African Americans in America, which has never dissipated. Talk about an intractable problem. Our race problem in America is critical, and often, brown peoples are sort of put into that same kind of racist concern. And so, there are people that you need to seek out to have these relationships. And frankly, Jews are somewhat insular and isolated also, so you probably have to go out of your way to find those Jews that will, form relationships. The Middle East does not help, because every time you build a friendship, something fires up in the Middle East, and suddenly the whole press is talking about, Jews and Muslims not getting along, as if there was here, right? There is not here. We need to deal with local issues and insist on it with Jews and others. That whole, yes, we have a big issue. I really do more support the Palestinians than I do the Jews, you might say. So yes, you could be honest to a Jew and say, but do we have to talk about that? Because we are trying to educate our kids in a school that is down the block from us. We are trying to get the right people into the planning department in the city of Sterling Heights. We both agree that the right people are not there now, and therefore we need to work together on that. It's that pointed kind of thing, because if you let that whole discussion go to the Middle East and those issues where clearly many of us do disagree on how that foreign policy should look and what America's presence ought to be like and all of that, you're not going to get any agreement, and you're going to get lots of betrayals, because as soon as they find out that you are on a different side on that, suddenly you're no longer friends anymore. As if you had changed. You didn't change, they didn't change. You got to keep that up front, that we do disagree on some things, but we're really going to forget about that and work on this stuff right here. So I say that knowledge is not enough. It's these relationships that really count in terms of how we're going to meet this. Now, there's some other things that we might do, but I want to say that keep in mind that the emotional issues are the key. I recently did a talk at the Muslim Unity Center in West Bloomfield, or Bloomfield Hills. I always forget exactly where that is. Is it Bloomfield Hills? Okay. And so one of the things I tried to show, for instance, was I showed a woman in a picture in hijab. And I said, some people are going to react to this woman and think something like she's a Muslim and therefore she's part of a loosely associated terrorist group, and I don't understand why those people hate us. And so the next picture I showed was a group of Catholic religious nuns wearing hijab, right? Wearing a veil is what the Catholics call it, but wearing a veil. We call it a veil, we don't call it hijab, right? So, and I said, and what's the image of these women? They're wearing hijab. Now, put those two pictures together, and those of us who had these great, marvelous women as our primary school teachers, when all of a sudden, the whole image changes in my mind. Oh, yeah, I remember Sister Mary Ann. She was such a wonderful person. She took good care of me, and she wore hijab. My pastor once said during a sermon, he said that his dentist is a Muslim woman, wears hijab, and she said, Father, does my head scarf make you uncomfortable? And he said, no, all of my grade school teachers wore headscarves. I think of you as a kindly person who's going to take good care of me and not cause me any pain. So that's, that's what you need. I mean, that's the kind of images that we need to be talking about. ISIS is like the Nazis. Right? Terrorism is like the Ku Klux Klan. Oh, I was never asked to apologize for the Ku Klux Klan. Why? Because all Christians knew the Ku Klux Klan wasn't Christian. No matter how many times they said it and how many crosses they burned, they weren't Christian. No one ever asked me to justify them. Why does your faith allow those people to do what they're doing? I don't have the foggiest idea. They're crazy. I don't know where they got those notions. It certainly didn't come out of the Bible I read. So those are the kinds of things that I think, those emotional things are the keys, bringing people together on that basis, understanding, you might even call those talking points, let's change the conversation.
I believe we only have less than 5 minutes left, so does anybody have any questions that they want to ask?
all right? Whoops, there's a long reach there. Sure, why don't you just go, can everybody hear her, or should I say it from here?
How can we make our Muslim youth understand the importance and the value of volunteering and its impact on Islamophobia and on Interfaith?
Okay.
That's the thing that,
Yeah, so how do we get our kids, how do we get our Muslim young people to understand that volunteering is key? And I'll start, if you don't mind, my answer would be give them the example. Take them with you. When you go to a group, they're not going to want to, you're going to have to ask them to put the, the video game aside or whatever for a brief time and get in the car and go with you. You're going to have to give them that example, and they may not do it all at once because they think they've got the problem solved, right? They've got this intercultural group of friends probably at school, and they think, what's the problem? It's just you adults that got the problem. It's not us. So you guys go solve it. And you're going to have to show them that this is not going away and that there's a larger community that they have to deal with. That would be my first.
I have to echo that. It's one, you have to lead by example in this. The other thing is that we as a society, as a culture, we need to lift up the value that's been kind of stripped away in our country of the common good. That we as citizens all have to work together for the common good of every resident within that community. And within the way that education is taking root right now, it's all about testing and math and science, etc. That's kind of what happens in schools. They have a little bit of time where they talk about social studies, which allows them to talk about larger civic matters. But a fundamental piece for our communities used to be that the public schools created a population to be good citizens, to understand how their government worked and to understand how it happens. As the public schools continue to get slammed, and you could argue that there's some folks in the state of Michigan that would like to get rid of the public schools and have everything be privatized and chartered. And so you have to fight against that. And so as much, again, it's about being engaged in the larger picture of what's going on, because there is a myth, I hear it frequently, that racism isn't as big an issue for youth today. That's what I always hear. Racism isn't a big issue for youth today. Look, they all get along, they all play sports. The reality is once you get into the world, the whole world is set up where race is a big deal. And so if you think you're just going to graduate to a world that is one of tolerance, you're not going to get there. Sir, you had a question?
Yeah, I will. And I want you to take a look at the Jewish community. One of the realities of the Jewish community is that they have kept never again the Holocaust as a potent image of the dangers of them not working together to combat this issue in the world. And so unless you understand never again in the Holocaust, you won't understand why the existence of Israel is so critical to them supporting, to their being in the world emotionally. And their response is to give a lot of money to that issue. And so you're going to have to build up the fact that there are some really stark issues within the Muslim community that need to be raised up so people can see the dangers and know that they're working together to fight those dangers. And so my suggestion is that unless you raise that emotional content of how critical it is and show the examples of people not being able to do what they want and being harmed by, or worse, the murdered in Chapel Hill where those 3 young people were murdered, if you don't keep those images in front of people so that they see the emotional content of why this is important, they will sort of go to their more convenient everyday lives without worrying about it. I think that there's a lot to be learned from the way the Jewish community keeps these issues live in the present of third, fourth, fifth generation Jews, right? They take them to Israel and so on. I mean, you know, if that's what, you need to bring them into situations where you can talk about these issues and they'll see them as important. We're told that the time is up, is that right?
Yeah, you have another.
So they're sending us to another conference. I'm glad to hear that there's interest, though, because that means that this conversation could not be finished in this one session. So
Exactly.
I realize there are still more questions, but nevertheless.
Okay, just I want you to know that myself and the two gentlemen here with Steve Spreitzer from the MRDI are really working with the leadership of the Muslim community here to put a strategy together for Michigan to combat Islamophobia. But again, this is not going to happen without your engagement and participation. So whatever strategy comes out, rest assured that you are going to be involved, inshallah ta'ala. Thank you so very much, Reverend Kuru and Bob.
I want to make one last comment real quick, is that it's not just the fundamentals of organizing is when you go to an event, don't just bring yourself, bring 3 or 4 or 5 of your friends. It's not just your involvement, it's getting your family and your friends involved. You got to get bigger, right? You've got to get larger.